inclusion and what I think it really means. It means conformity, inequity, and exclusion is what it means.
Addressing woke culture. Today's episode, we tackle a sensitive but highly politicized issue that's become a highly charged conversation point in the digital and offline worlds. And to give a broader context, it's clear that the pandemic has not only birthed a humanitarian crisis of profound order, but has also exposed the deep fragilities in our society and the growing political divisions amongst us. And woke culture is one of those issues that is highly contentious, it's highly sensitive. And in the course of the introduction to my interview with our guest today, I speak of those sensitivities. So I won't speak at length now, but I would like to move on to introduce our guest today, who's written extensively on these subjects. Our guest is Michael Rectenwald, who's a former professor of liberal studies at the NY University of the United States, where he served as a professor from 2008 to 2019. Now, what's interesting about Michael is that he was a self-declared Marxist whose entire worldview shifted over the course of his academic career when the political climate on campus began to change significantly, where he observed everything from victimology, cancel culture, no platforming, political correctness, and he responded by creating a Twitter account to address what he saw as the excesses on campus. And predictably, his account was soon discovered and reached a point where he had to leave his academic career behind. He has gone on to write several books on the rise of woke culture, including a book called Beyond Woke. And he's also written extensively on totalitarianism and the Great Reset. In this particular interview, we explore the origins of woke culture and how it's deviated from its original beginnings, and explore some of the present issues that are showing up within our mainstream culture. This is a difficult interview. It's obviously going to be one that's highly contentious, but I think it's an important conversation. It's important that, yes, we have safe spaces for those who need those types of conversations, particularly where there's vulnerable members of society. But I do think we also need courageous conversations to tackle these social issues. And this is one of those courageous conversations. And you'll hear in my opening gambit the nerves that I had in even bringing this conversation to the table. But it's important that we do find the courage to have open debate around these key topics. Before we get into today's interview, I want to let you know of something that's coming up. Last night, we had our monthly town hall conversation within the Elevate network, and we explored the fact that the political system is broken, not only in the UK, but in other places around the world. And I shared details of a forthcoming tour, which we are going to take out on the road in the UK to explore political solutions. So you can tune into the replay from last night's session. But to find out more, I invite you to come and join us inside the Elevate network at weareelevate.org. Okay, without further ado, sit back and enjoy today's conversation with our special guest, Michael Rectenwald. Dr. Michael Rectenwald, it's great to have you here on the Elevate podcast. Now, we were just discussing in preparation for this conversation the intrepidation I have coming into this interview, because we've covered all manner of topics over the last couple of years, looking at the pandemic, some very divisive subject matter. I've taken all manner of heat. I've had to develop an incredibly thick skin, examining some of the issues around the pandemic, the vaccines, the kind of globalist culture that's emerging, very divisive topics. And one of the issues that we've touched upon but not really dived into is this cultural fragility, which is manifesting in the culture wars and some of the elements of the woke culture that's emerging, the links between what we've seen around the kind of totalitarian response to the pandemic, some of the underlying trajectories and factors around post-modernity and how that's showing up as post-truth. But to target this conversation specifically head on, I know it is going to be very divisive, and I'm willing to have that conversation. But coming into this conversation with you, there's a real heat behind the conversation, and I can already anticipate some of the reactions. But as a result of this to me speaks into what I've shared a number of times on the podcast recently, Michael, is that we've got this old phrase of it's a revolutionary act to speak the truth. Well, we're now in a position where it's a revolutionary act to simply speak, because we are so stifled by these divisive topics that people are witnessing things they're uncomfortable about, but they don't know how to address the conversation. And this is where I am right now in this conversation. So I'm here as a humble student. You can take the guise of the academic again for this conversation and bring us up to speed, because I want to understand what's happening here and how what we've witnessed within the pandemic and some of the trends are playing out through our culture. And I think what's interesting about bringing you onto the show, Michael, is that you self-declared Marxist in the first instance, and you've been on a journey that's led you on a different path. And we're seeing some of the roots of that Marxism potentially showing up today, and that's kind of what I want to see and examine. So it's a great pleasure to have you on the show. Please forgive my sensitivities around this. Hopefully we'll have a really productive conversation.
No, it's my pleasure, and I want to start by apologizing for the American export of wokeness to your country.
Well, tell me about that then. Is it an export? Where does it begin? I mean, I don't even, right here, I'm here to learn the origins. What is the definition? How do we describe woke culture? What does it mean? Where did it come from? How has it evolved? I'm really curious. Let's begin there.
Oh, that's a big sure. But let me just say that, first of all, the social justice as a term has a deep history. And it extends all the way back to 1841, 2, and 3. The first usage of the phrase social justice was actually mobilized by a Trappist monk, an Italian Trappist monk named Luigi Tapparelli. And social justice was to be added to the Catholic doctrines of various types of justice, like communitative justice and whatever the Catholic notions of justice that came from Thomas Aquinas. And this Luigi Tapparelli added social justice to the mix, and what he was talking about was nothing like what social justice is today. What it had to do with was it was a means by which to address the issues revolving around the Industrial Revolution and the immiseration of the working class, if you will, in Britain, and in particular Britain, because this was where the Industrial Revolution first took off. And it really wasn't about a redistribution of goods like it came to signify later by 1970s with John Rawls's philosophy of social justice. It really had to do with how do you treat your fellow human beings, and it really was a charity scheme, basically setting up a system of charities and direction of between individuals, but also a kind of subsidiarity. That is, the smallest organization that can treat a problem should treat it, and only then should it go, only if it fails should it go to a higher level. So it begins with the individual, goes to the charities, then maybe the province, maybe the town, maybe the state, maybe the federal government, or what have you. But so then the term was changed when the Catholic encyclical of 1892 was published, and it meant, by then already, it meant basically a redistribution scheme. And then it was taken up by leftists and liberals as a means for redistributing wealth. And social justice came to mean basically redressing systemic inequities, systemic inequities, and on a group basis now, not through charity, but basically through the state. So you could say that social justice was basically socialism with holy water sprinkled on it. In the case of the Catholic appropriation of the term by the Pope. And then wokeness now is the term has a interesting history. It actually started off to mean in the African American community to mean basically hip to present day realities, just awake to what's going on, just awareness of issues. And then it slowly transmuted into an awareness of social and especially racial injustice. It made its way into the Oxford English Dictionary by, I think, 2017, at which point it meant this, keen or awake to social, especially racial injustice. So these two terms, social justice and wokeness, then became linked. So it was around 2016, 17 that wokeness basically came to stand for social justice. And it also imports, social justice does now, it imported very many other elements besides this redistribution idea. It imported all kinds of identity issues, which came out of postmodern theory, really, postmodernism. And it came to mean basically having to do with the equitable treatment of beleaguered minorities, whether they be racial, gender, sexual proclivity minorities. So then it also it imported some of the postmodern epistemological issues, like a kind of subjectivism, where you get to the point where you have, my truth, this kind of anti-objectivity, this kind of basically this sort of skepticism for all objective reality and objective criteria. And then it also picked up, social justice did, and then it's of course merged with wokeness. It picked up Stalinist and Chinese communist techniques and disciplinary mechanisms, such as auto-critique, which meant criticizing of oneself and one's ideology, and also struggle sessions. Struggle sessions where the group, gangs up on a particular person and, attempts to expose their ideological errors,
Mhm.
And so this is where we get the cancel culture from. This is the Stalinist and Chinese communist mechanisms of auto-critique and struggle sessions. They transmute into cancel culture. So cancel culture really is a kind of struggle session routine, imported from Chinese communist and Stalinist means. So that's the kind of a short history of this. And yeah.
Well, I mean, just from the initial explanation of its origins to where it is today, that's quite a leap in terms of what it meant, how it manifests, how it shows up within culture and society. You've mentioned a couple of kind of what I would describe as kind of generator functions as through post-modernity and the resulting subjectivity that's come with that. You've mentioned kind of overseas culture from China and other kind of philosophies. What in your mind has been the most significant driver of the shifts within the culture, which from its relatively humble origin?
Well, I think it's essentially linked to a Marxist ideological predisposition to pit basically the underclass, whether they be class, economic class constituents or identity constituents, against some overlord, or, in the case of Marxism, the capitalist class. In the case of wokeness, the identity categories that are supposedly oppressive, like the white straight male and so on and so forth. So this is the main sort of ethos that it adopts from Marxist ideology, that it has this kind of uh, class struggle involved in it. The class could be, as I said, it can be seen in terms of economics, or it can see it, and it's transmuted into an identity issue or identity issues, and it's seen in terms of identity struggles with the oppressive classes, or especially the oppressive class being the straight white male. And what I think got it accelerated, frankly, was actually, and this is pretty controversial, but I'll say anyway, was the rise of Donald Trump in the United States. This is when I saw an acceleration and intensification of wokeness. First, I saw it in the university system, and this is what caused me to have a run-in with my own university, New York University. And then it got metastasized to the social body, the body politic, and has been adopted by almost every institution on that there is. Almost all the dominant institutions, and also the corporate world, the state, in the United States, the alphabet agencies, the military, everything. So it has been, they've used Donald Trump as a foil to accelerate this, because he was the trigger, to use one of their terms. Trump triggered this acceleration, really.
Well, I would like to unpack that. So, on that basis, you were working academia at the time. I'm very curious to hear how that showed up in academia, because it's often said that culture almost flows from academic institutions. I'm curious to know whether that you think that's a reflection of reality, but I'm more curious to know your experience and how this started to show up, particularly within the context of what you've just shared.
Yeah, I think there is some truth to the idea that academia is kind of like the cathedral, to put it in Mencius Moldbug's terms. That is, it is the papacy from which these pronunciations come ex cathedra to the rest of the population. But I saw it showing up in 2016 with the adoption of such things as, for example, safe spaces and trigger warnings on syllabi. The no platforming of speakers began very, very much to intensify. I saw cancellations on my own campus. I saw safe spaces being erected. I saw bias reporting hotline being enacted so that a student could report on the bias infractions of their fellow students, but especially their professors. That is, those who violated some bias infraction. This was instituted at NYU in 2016. Suddenly there was this bias reporting hotline, and I saw it as a kind of Stasi state being imparted on the university level, in a very pernicious development, frankly. Because it turned everybody into a kind of sentinel of surveillance on campus. And they never even defined what a bias infraction was, what a microaggression was. They just rolled this thing out, and all of a sudden, people were encouraged to report these biases. Trigger warnings, which are, academic really, but did start, frankly, in feminism on the internet, and then made their way into academia, onto syllabi. And that's a slippery slope to basically banning books that are deemed offensive. And it's gotten all the way to the point now where, SOAS, for example, in London, basically has banished all white male philosophers from their curriculum. So this is basically how this is rolled out, I think. And Trump was a trigger because he was anti-woke. He didn't really say why or what political correctness meant, but he kept denouncing it. And then he seemed to represent every form of racism and reaction that totally terrified the left and caused them to go into mass hysteria, really.
I mean, this is fascinating. The bias piece alone. I just want to pick up on that. We've had recently on the show a behavioral expert who, through the pandemic, had been examining human behavior during the last 2 years and why some people are so accepting of grand narratives, why others challenge narratives. And he's identified something like 200 different types of bias and why they occur and how they show up. So, and I suppose from what you're describing, there's these particular biases are with specific reference to identity or character traits.
And to identity in particular, did you show some sort of a bias against a particular identity group in the, as instanced by your treatment of an individual or statements you made about a group? Did you show some sort of bias towards against transgender people, against racial minorities, against religious minorities, except for Christians, which is okay, against what have you? That was basically the pretext, which was never explained. Of course, if there's 200 some biases, they weren't concerned with all of them by any stretch of the imagination. They were concerned with a certain subset of biases having to do with identity politics.
The issue I find complicated here is I look back at my time at university when I was 18 to 21 years old here in the UK. I deemed myself to be reasonably intelligent at the time, but if I look back, certainly at some of my behavior during that time, certainly I've evolved as a human being a great deal since that time. What I know now is leaps ahead, and my understanding of the world and how we interact is so far evolved from my time at university. And I'm curious. I actually, 18, legally an adult. Now I feel like an adult. I own a home. I've got a baby. I've got a state car. How much more adult? How much more adult could you be? But at the time, there was this youthful naivety, I think, and I'm curious about how all of this is showing up within educational institutions, because it's not just universities. I'm learning about this across other forms of education.
Right.
I just don't know if. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe people would say otherwise. But I'd be curious to know, with the limited worldview that one could possibly have as a younger person, how you can start to make these cultural assessments.
It's very difficult. You'd have to do some reading, and you'd have to do some study of the histories of all this, and you'd have to see the context and understand how this stuff evolved and what it signifies. You'd have to have some political theory for explaining it. Of course, you could go the psychological route as Desmond does, or you could go into the studies of ideology and just how they propagate and what they do, what are their effects. It's very difficult for an 18-year-old to walk into a classroom to make sense of what's happening, except to rather much more easier is just simply to imbibe it and repeat it ad nauseum, because that'll give you more success in that setting, because that's what's being propagated there. It's much easier just to rant and rave, go to a lecture by Charles Murray, for example, and just call him a fascist and a racist and a sexist and whatever, and to keep chanting these things ad nauseum, because this is what's encouraged, actually. They don't ask you to read Charles Murray. They don't ask you to think about the issues. I'm just taking Charles Murray as an example who popped into my head. They don't ask you to examine the pretext or the premises underneath of all this. They just expect you to accept it. And it went so far as this. in 2017, a student applying to Stanford University, the third-rated university in the United States, put on his essay, submitted as his essay for acceptance, in answer to the question, what matters to you and why? He answered hashtag Black Lives Matter 100 times, and that was the essay. And they accepted him into Stanford University. That's how far this has gone. It shows to me that they're actually looking for these kind of singers in a social justice choir. They're not looking for critical thinking or examination. They just want people to parrot back these rote plug and play phrases without any consideration about what's involved, what it means, whether it's true, whether the premises underlying them are true, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, I mean, there's a couple of points I want to advance on from here. Firstly, I'm just from your own background, just the links. You've obviously experienced this during the height of the reactionary response to Donald Trump getting to power. That was happening in real time when you were working in academia, but also from your own declaration as a former Marxist yourself, contemplating becoming a Trotskyist. For those that don't know, a Russian-Ukrainian Marxist revolutionary. Did you feel an inner sense of conflict as any of these things were playing out? Did you feel any sense of alignment with what was going on? Did you feel an alignment with perhaps what the intent was, but the means was most questionable to you? I'm very curious how that played out for you.
At first, it was more of a criticism of all of this from the left. I was criticizing social justice and wokeness and identity politics from a Marxist leftist standpoint. And basically, my initial criticism was that this is no way to improve or overthrow capitalism. This is no means by which to unify the working class. This is divisive. This identity politics is destructive of the real left and all that. But I soon came to see that, in fact, the whole left had adopted this, including Marxists, and they were all running with it. And then it really was no distinction in the left, and I couldn't abide by the left at all, any segment of it. In fact, when I voiced these critiques from the left, I was attacked roundly by almost all elements of the left, not only in the university, but outside of it. And my criticisms were, as I said, made from a Marxist standpoint. And yet I was roundly rejected, and I was a member of a left communist group at the time, and they put me on a basic show trial, cyber show trial, if you will, and condemned me for a number of infractions that I had supposedly committed, which really had to do with sounding like a member of the opposite tribe, appearing on conservative news outlets, because my story became a national story here. So I said, I really can't have anything to do with this. And then I began to do some deep reading. I had, of course, had done deep reading before. I was an academic, but my field was actually 19th century British science. And so I was starting to delve into now the history of communism. And then I went into the economics, and I came to reject it entirely. And then I had a wholesale rejection of all leftism.
Yes, that's quite a turnaround.
And I did it's in later in life. I'm not a spring chicken, but yeah.
I mean, so you were witnessing what's happening, and you were obviously taking a contrary position to the trends that were emerging. You did that through essays. You set up a Twitter account. What
right.
was you've shared some of the responses from other segments of the left, and obviously that didn't sound particularly favorable. What was the overall mix of response to the material that you were distributing?
Basically, I was called every name in the book, from a fascist to alt-right to white supremacist to to a Nazi, you know, the whole panoply of epithets that are hurled at any dissenting voice. And, you know, none of this could be further from the truth. As a matter of fact, I was turning into a libertarian, cultural libertarian and civil libertarian, not a fascist by any stretch. In fact, I was turning towards individualism as an overriding precept and belief, which is anything but fascist, because fascism is a collectivism. It's a very collectivist ideology that stemmed straight out of Marxian theory. So, I mean, all you have to do is read Mussolini's Intellectuals, a great book that'll tell you just how fascism came out of socialism. But yeah, I was being pelted with all kinds of abuse. On my campus, I was basically totally isolated and deemed a pariah. People wouldn't get on an elevator with me. I was then, after being lambasted on official email in the university by a bunch of social justice warriors, instead of chastising them. By the way, had I been another identity category, these people would have been fired summarily for what they were saying on public email. Instead, they moved my office to the Russian department, not a department I had nothing to do with, you know, academically, and isolated me on campus. And I like to say, in my own personal gulag. It was a completely Siberia-like experience within the university.
And then what? I mean, how long did that continue for? You're obviously no longer working at NYU.
Yeah, I sued those professors and the university for defamation and libel, and the case was settled, although dismissed because my attorneys couldn't overcome the motion to dismiss. Nevertheless, after that, I still settled with the university and left with a retirement package, frankly, plus a little cash payout. So those who say I was fired are wrong. I was never fired. I retired in good standing, still have access to all of NYU's electronic and other resources, was given a retirement package replete with benefits. So I wasn't fired. By the way, by the time I left, I was a full professor. I had been promoted in the interim during all this madness. They couldn't reject my application for promotion because they would have had to then really, they really would have had a major discrimination case on their hands, because I just, compared to the other applicants, I was overqualified for the promotion. So, I mean, I'm not going to go into that, but let's just say that it wasn't friendly. I left in January of 2019 officially. That's like 2.5 years of dealing with this.
Yes, yes. Well, you've gone on to continue your work and commentary. You've written books on this. You've continued to write essays and examine the kind of the trends as they've evolved. This idea that I mentioned around reasonable intent but questionable means, to what degree is this playing out? Because this idea of social justice, as you originally described from its origins, again had a reasonable feel to it, but now, and to give context as well, there are plenty of people inside of the Elevate community who care deeply about the various different issues that the kind of social justice movement campaign on, but they feel very uncomfortable with the way in which things are manifesting through violence, aggression, hate, discrimination, burning buildings, all of these things they're very uncomfortable with.
They should be.
So where has this broken down and now? And
well, what it is it's a totalitarian movement. This is very clear. It is totalitarian in character, and that is to say, it abides no dissent, and it attempts to use all means at its disposal to crush its opponents politically, socially, economically, and otherwise. So it has taken on characteristics that resemble what happened in the Soviet Union with the Bolshevik Revolution and the Great Terror and the Red Terror and the purges and we don't have physical gulags, we have digital gulags. I've written about that in my book Google Archipelago. We don't have real struggle sessions like as in China, but we do have effectively cancel culture. So it's a totalitarian movement that has a great grip on the whole culture and society, and it is a pernicious development that has nothing to do with actually addressing or redressing the so-called beleaguered situation of the underclass or the minority racial groups or even sexual identity groups or genders. It uses those people as a means by which to destroy the so-called oppressors. That's really what it's about. It has nothing to do with uh, creating a situation of equality or equity. It's actually an inversion ideology that attempts to flip the hierarchy on its head and put those putatively at the top on the bottom and vice versa. That's why in the games derogatorily defined or called the oppression Olympics, you want to rush to the bottom because the race to the bottom is actually a race to the top, even though the race is running downhill.
Yeah, I mean, someone said to me the other day in commentary, I mentioned that we had an interview coming up on this particular topic, and they said to me that this idea of equality, diversity, and inclusion sounds reasonable on paper until you read the small print, where if you're white, middle class, conservative, Christian,
Mm-hmm.
etc., some combination of the above, then it doesn't apply to you. And that might sound very contrarian, but actually, in terms of what I witness, there does seem to be evidence of that playing out. Almost that it's become, even if there is historical injustice within these communities, the idea that there's some latent unconscious bias that plays out today in our own behavior, I find, I'm very skeptical of that idea, though I am also understanding that how our unconscious patterns can play a role in how we live. But from my understanding, those unconscious patterns are usually developed through childhood, our exposure to our family, and again, they may have historic viewpoints that they're adopted. But the idea today that we should ostracize groups of people or discriminate against groups of people who are in some way ancestrally linked to former oppressors, I find very difficult to comprehend, because that means that we're all part of the problem. And that feels like the way this is being positioned. It could be very naive of me to say. As I said at the beginning, I'm starting to get my head around this, and this is why I wanted to speak to you today to try and get a perspective on this. Would you be able to comment on that notion?
Yeah, I think you articulated it very well. And I think it's accurate. That is to say, well, let me just go back and talk about the phrase diversity, equity, and inclusion and what I think it really means. It means conformity, inequity, and exclusion is what it means. That is, it means conformity to their ideology, it means inequity if you don't conform, and it means exclusion from the community for nonconformists. So now, it doesn't redress anything historically, and it's using people's identities as a means by which to destroy opponents. It doesn't have, first of all, I don't believe in ancestral or class guilt. This comes out of Marxism, this idea of class guilt that, based on your history, your family history, that you have some guilt for the so-called transgressions of your ancestors. Secondly, it got moved over, of course, into race, and I don't believe in racial guilt either. I think that's a mistake. It's a crazy mistaken notion. that is based on all kinds of slippery reasoning that's never articulated really. But and then, of course, whenever they can't find racism in you as an individual, it's ascribed to systemic racism, which is just a term that's used whenever they can't find it individually, playing out from individual attitudinal predispositions. So historically, I would say, where I come down on this is like, for example, if in fact that I have some possession that was stolen from your ancestors, I owe you that money, or I owe you that possession. Like, for example, if your grandmother had stolen my grandmother's wedding ring, okay, this is just hypothetical. We could flip it if you wish. I don't mean to impute guilt to
It's
you.
all right. It's all right.
And you had possession of that ring now, you owe me the ring. Okay, if I'm the only living ancestor or descendant, I should say. So, that I think is true. So in that sense, reparations, for example, in the United States, should fall to those people that actually benefited from something. But that's a very, very tiny minority, and they probably don't even exist. Tracking that and tracing it would be absurd.
Well, also this is going into the kind of the example, almost role playing it in my mind. I'm like, well, hang on a minute. How do you know that my family stole it?
That's right.
If someone didn't buy it off someone in history, then it became an heirloom that got passed down. But there is, if it's so historic to find the burden of proof. Now, okay, I understand we're oversimplifying around a very simple example, and we're talking societal and cultural, and it's a little bit different. But I get the message, and it's very difficult. And it's also, if I found out that, even if I found out that my neighbor, my physical neighbor here, that something of this nature had happened 100 years ago, and there was a theft within our families, I might think, oh, that's a pain in the ass. But I'm not going to blame them. I'm not going to blame them.
Right.
They got no connection to it whatsoever.
You wouldn't blame them. You might want the property back, but you can't impute guilt to them, except in the case that they refuse to relinquish the object. But in this case, for slavery, for example, first of all, it wouldn't fall all against whites if this kind of reparations were to take place. There were many black slave drivers, but also traders, and there were, this is not fall along racial lines strictly. So there's no real way to adjudicate this. And in the case of the United States, the situation with African Americans in the United States, to whatever extent they face inequities and so forth, really hasn't to do with these. They have to do with much more proximate causes that have to do with, in fact, the Great Society in the United States that decimated the black family by handing out welfare to mothers that weren't married, as opposed to those who had the husbands in the home. This destroyed the family in the black community. This is really what did it. So you can blame Democrats for that here in the United States, not their arch rivals. And I'm not here touting a Republican line. I'm just talking about an analysis that actually works. I'm neither a Republican nor a Democrat.
Yeah, I think a lot of us are feeling politically homeless right now.
Yeah, that's right.
So there's something I want to draw upon here, just in terms of extracting the kind of thought process that underpins it. Using the example that you've shared, the ring. Let's say, you want it back, but the person isn't willing to give it back. Is that argument being made that systemically, certain groups have benefited from history to a greater degree, and therefore this is almost the social version of asking for the ring back or taking the ring back?
That's exactly what it is. But it discounts all kinds of other things. For example, simply merit, that people have attained their statuses based on merit, and that there is ancestral advantage given to some people based on their how well their ancestors did. But that, I think, follows on simply property rights. It's a property rights issue. There should be no reason to suggest that because your ancestors have done well economically that you owe somebody something on that basis. that doesn't stand to reason. Of course, this all goes back to Marxism at base. If you accept the Marxist premise of exploitation, which I do not, then you can always justify this, but this is never really articulated by a lot of these people because they don't realize this is the root of it. But the Marxist theory of exploitation, that at the point of production, the capitalist class exploits the worker, steals half of the proceeds effectively, and then, keeps it to themselves. That's the premise. It's all based on the labor theory of value, which I won't get into, but it is a false theory. The labor theory of value is bunk. And then, this is where value comes from. It comes from labor strictly. That's not true. That's not true at all. So, once you explode some of these premises that are underlying all this ethos, then you get freed from this nonsense, because this is nonsense. There's no truth to the idea that somebody whose family did well in the past somehow owes somebody something from the past, even if they had no thing to do with that person.
Yeah, it gets very complicated very quickly. I have somewhat of I can have somewhat of an obsessive compulsive disorder with things that I do. I'm obsessed around details, and I once signed up to my family tree, and I lost a weekend just clicking back trying to find my entire family tree. I don't know what I was looking for, some hope that connected to some sort of luminary.
Yeah, that's right. Some noble origins. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
Sure.
I didn't get it.
Yeah.
I think I found I think I found the opposite. But the point being, for that, to try and make sense of the entire history, if I was to go back and say, well, my present circumstances today aren't as good as they could be, what point during my and actually, quite frankly, it was the opposite. My family tree didn't come from a wealthy lineage. Quite the opposite. But I don't look back thinking, where did I miss out? What injustice am I experiencing today as a result of my lineage of family? How have I been let down by my family tree, or how have I benefited from my family tree? And I rather think about, what are my life circumstances today,
and what can you do about it?
And what can I do about it? And what would I like them to look about tomorrow? And if I aggregate that out to a societal level, I start to think, and because I'm keen. And I'd love to throw some other ideas at you in a minute in terms of where we are now, in terms of parallels and how our generation of the last 2 years could end up repeating the same problem if we're not careful. But I think about social change and what I'd like, the changes I'd like to see in the world, and it's generally driven by a set of values that include things like love, kindness, compassion, various other virtues, I guess, traditional philosophical virtues that I would like to see myself embodying, so that when I communicate with others, I do so from a place of heart, even if I don't agree with them, because there's plenty we can all disagree on in the world. But to do so in a way that is respectful, and to honor the other person as a human being, and to see that magnified out at scale, that we have a way of living amongst ourselves. And even though we see the world differently amongst the whole of society, of course we're going to. There's 7-8 billion of us. We're not going to see the world the same. And how boring and tragic would it be if we did? But it almost bizarrely feels like that's the road we're on. It's this uniformity of thinking.
Yes, this goes back to collectivism in general. What you described was a precept that basically we're individuals, and that our ethics and our behavior drive from ourselves as individuals, and that to make some sort of change in the world, we should do so ourselves, and rather than looking for some systemic change and trying to bring about this systemic overthrow or change. This is a recognition that you have, and I agree with it entirely, is that the premise here is individual behavior, because this is A, all we can really change, and B, this should be the ethics on which we operate, because this collectivism is actually unethical. It's unethical because it infringes other people's rights, their property rights, their rights to self-determination, free speech, and other rights. And so when you begin with a methodological individualism, which is what Ludwig von Mises, the great classical liberal philosopher and economist, argued, then you have the right premise for analysis. And because the collective as such doesn't exist really, it's an abstraction from individuals. I don't believe in class struggle as a reality. I don't believe that there is a working class that's this consolidated unit that has the same interests and the same intentionality and the same consciousness, in Marxist terms, the same, circumstances at all. Everybody's got different circumstances, and everybody is bringing their own talents to bear. So that it really dissolves into a free market economy, which is the most just and ethical means of distributing wealth.
So, I mean, I look at this point. I've looked at this point around individualism and collectivism with a reasonable degree of attention over the last couple of years, because you and I haven't discussed what your views on the pandemic are, but at one point my views were described as selfish because I was saying that lockdowns are going to cause egregious harms, the long-term ramifications are going to be significant. The government overreach that's playing out, the corporatization of many of the different things that were happening. I was arguing that these measures are going to have much longer term costs than benefit. As such, billions of days of children's education would be lost. The healthcare systems would be overwhelmed for the next 10 years, if not longer. The patient, and we're already seeing that, the patient waiting list, the economic fallout we're now seeing. So I was described as being overly individual and selfish, but I was arguing that these costs are going to significantly outweigh the benefits of the perceived benefits of various policy. Whereas I actually see that what my commentary was here was in the quote unquote collective interest, because I'm saying if we actually zoom out and take a systems approach to looking at this and look at the aggregate, more holistic ramifications of every policy decision, because we get into this myopic focus of like, okay, we've got this number of infections, let's get that down at all other costs. And if we think like that but that plays out everywhere. I've come to discover that very narrow thinking. We don't think in systems thinking anymore, if we ever did. But that notion of individualism and collectivism, I think they are terms that have become deeply politicized. And I feel like I do feel like I'm part of a community, both within a network that I've created within the Elevate project, and we're all uniquely different.
But what I would say to that is that one does better for the collective by pursuing one's own individual interests.
Yes.
I know that. I mean, this goes back to Adam Smith, of course, and but I think it's actually true, and it makes sense in terms of the division of labor. With the division of labor, you have people using their talents, and it creates wealth. And this wealth is then distributed through the market. So when people pursue their own interests, they actually make for a greater pie of wealth that's created. And that then impacts everybody. And this is not trickle down economics. This is actually economics 101. This means that whenever I pursue my interests, I have a certain niche and a talent, and that division of labor allows for the production of greater and greater goods and wealth and the differentiation of the market, and it then it allows a much greater efficiency of production, such that we get greater wealth from that efficiency. So if we all got reduced to basically doing the same thing, we're on family farms with no exchange, we'd be living in poverty, we'd be living in misery, we might not even survive. So
yes, I mean, I'm with you on the economics. I think where it gets tricky, and I think this is where we can go to the next piece now, is, in fact, I was part of a panel today, and actually one of the speakers said that the real problem we're facing is the corporatization of markets. And was the Mises School and other Austrian schools, etc., are in favor of free markets.
Yeah.
And I am generally, well, historically have been 100% behind free markets, but in the last couple of years, my concerns have been raised around the overall impact of corporations, major
Sure.
corporations, on civilian life, but not just on
Absolutely.
civilian life, on governments. So on one hand, we've seen kind of government overreach on the citizen side, classically, one rule for them and one rule for others, but underreach when it comes to corporations and the power that they wield. But I'd like to examine this within the conversation we're having here, within the kind of this idea that's being posed as woke capitalism, but the role, because the adoption of these ideas within the kind of corporate world. How is, because I see some links to what we've just been discussing here.
Yeah. I've been talking about this. I've been writing about and talking about this a great deal, and I'm writing about it in great depth in my next book, which is about this. So I'm against corporatism too, which is what you've described here. But I think corporatism is effectively when the state and these corporations collude in order to produce effective monopolies of the economy. And this is what we're up against. And under the COVID regime, we saw the merging of corporate and state power. And this is something that's been going on for a while. Now, as far as woke capitalism goes, what I see woke capitalism as is not just a PR campaign or advertising campaign on the part of corporations to make themselves more appealing to the woke community and buyers, and it's not simply a gloss on their behavior. It is an economic structure, and it is a monopoly scheme. It is a means by which to drive out certain competitors from the marketplace in order for the woke corporations to monopolize their particular niches. But it's really more of a cartel. It's a cartel scheme. If you don't subscribe to wokeness and all the criteria of the stakeholder capitalism model, or ESG scores, the environmental, social, and governance index, then you are going to be starved of capital. This is coming from the very top. This is being levied by such players as BlackRock Inc. and Vanguard Group and State Street and UBS and other major multi-trillion-dollar asset managers who are forcing these issues through the marketplace, not through government right now, but through the market. And this is a scheme to monopolize. This is a cartel operation. This is not unlike the kinds of monopoly schemes undertaken by the so-called robber barons in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
Now, yeah. So I see this in many different sectors. In terms of this particular conversation around wokeism and the corporatization, I'm trying to figure out whether this is a kind of chicken and egg situation. Where does it begin? Where does it end? Is this corporations witnessing a cultural trend and using it to capitalize on that particular trend, or are they part of the origination of this culture? Which where does it begin? Where does it end? Because my mind just goes to if say there was a counterculture revolution and conservatism became the most positive prominent way of thinking. Would the corporations flip to go with the culture just to maximize?
Yeah, that's a great question. Sorry for sort of speaking over you there a second. I got to watch that. But I think it does originate on the ground ideologically, but then the corporations appropriated this and used it as a shibboleth that they use now as a kind of demarcation device for cartelization, for creating a woke cartel. And then they now are the main drivers of this. So this, yes, it has cultural roots, but it's become adopted and then used and now weaponized in the economy by these major corporations to drive their own interests. And there isn't a it isn't, the phrase should not be go woke and go broke. It should be go woke or go broke, because that's really what it amounts to. Um, that speaks to a scheme to take this woke ideology and to drive it into the economy as a means for demarcating the woke from the unwoke, and likewise making the woke the beneficiaries. There, it's a kind of in economic terms and marketing terms, it's the first adopter is always the most gets the most benefits from any particular development like this. So they're trying to get out ahead and adopt this first and make it the mechanism, the means by which they dominate the economy.
I mean, I'm also seeing here the kind of role of the World Economic Forum, for the last, I don't know how many years it is, 50, 60 years, promoting this model of stakeholder capitalism. But by doing that,
Right.
they have intrinsically brought politics into business, because
absolutely.
But the difficulty then is that these cultural trends, the political trends, it creates market imbalances in the way that
absolutely
companies portray themselves, and to me that further exacerbates existing cultural fragilities. It exacerbates division and polarization. And look
absolutely.
at where we are. We are falling apart as a community of human beings on this one little rock in the sky. We are
absolutely.
So I'm very concerned about the trajectory we're on, but it seems like the rocket fuel is behind this trajectory of stakeholder capitalism driven by the WEF. But here's where I think things get interesting, and I'm curious about your perspective on this. And I'm also interesting to look at the parallels. Is the culture we've described right now is not just the culture, it's within academic institutions, it's within business, it's within politics, it's within sport, and effectively it's become the establishment. And
that's right.
If you look at the 1960s, which in itself was a counterculture movement, interestingly enough, you might comment on this as well, that may have been the kind of original accelerant of this type of more postmodernist subjective ascent. But I'm curious of whether now there will be a comparable counterculture revolution where there's a new rallying against the establishment and the current culture.
It's going to be a very difficult one because of the way the opposition has been figured, represented and figured by the dominant institutions. You see, there's in progressivism, there's always the sense of the progressive, the new, the avant-garde is superior to the retrograde, the backward, the reactionary, as they figure this. So a counterculture now would have to look like a reactionary movement in the terms under which this has been set up. It would look like a retrograde movement, and it's being figured that way as such. So a return to a free market without these distortions of wokeness, which create, as you said, they distort the market, they distort the culture, they create further divisions. They actually help the elite at the expense of the vast majority. This has to be recognized, and this has to be refigured in terms that actually look radical. So the counterculture has to look radical and not regressive in its approach to all this. And the way to do it is to unite the left and the right against the elite, not the ruling class as in class structure, but this is a political and economic elite that are in bed with each other. If the left and the right can see that they have a common rival, and it's not to depose capitalism and overthrow capitalism in favor of some socialist utopia, because that's what these people want. The World Economic Forum leaders are actually socialists at base. The reason why elitists want socialism is because it's a monopoly system, just like monopoly capitalism. It's a monopoly, and they will always maintain their position at the top of this monopoly scheme. So we have to make the counterculture look radical, or it will never be adopted.
Yeah, I mean the idea that you'll own nothing and be happy begs the question: someone will own.
Something's you're gonna rent everything you own. Who's gonna be the guy that's renting it to you? Who's gonna rent it to you? You know.
Well,
and
yeah, it's Animal Farm. Some animals are more equal than others. You know, it's that's the problem within that ideology.
Right. They know what's better for you, and you'll be better off when they manage and control the whole economic system, because you can't be trusted to drive cars and eat meat, because you're going to destroy the world. And likewise, we have to take over. We must control all of your behavior. We must control the economy. We must have all woke corporations. This is basically the premise, and it's a disempowering, disenfranchising, utterly elitist scheme that leaves the rest of us basically without any recourse, you know. And they're doing the same thing with, for example, some of the technologies and their adoption. You know, they're figuring anybody who opposes, like, for example, the rolling out of the metaverse as the way we live. They're going to figure this as, you know, anti-technology, neo-Luddite fanaticism, you know. So this is the way that this gets structured, so that opposition looks backward, you know. That's how this works. That's how progressivism figures its opponents.
I mean, there's a lot of things to unravel here. So for me, this is an interesting examine. This kind of idea of counterculture is an interesting one. I mean, I've been talking about social change in terms of what that means to me in the context of where we are in the pandemic and how things need to, you know, the kind of the environment that we're living in now. Some of the issues we've just discussed as at the forefront of those issues. But I've come to realize the progressivism, the idea of progress, and Charles Eisenstein, who's recently been on the show, speaks about this, and we spoke about it in our interview, is that itself, the idea of progress is part of the problem. But from my perspective, there's a piece of social change that actually requires preservation, because the progressivism or progress assumes almost by default that everything is broken and needs to be fixed. What it fails to recognize and appreciate is what actually is beautiful, what is wonderful, what makes our society great, what makes us, what keeps us alive, you know, the joy de vivre. And that requires a preservationism, which interestingly is a more conservative ideology typically. So we've seen this imbalance almost, and no matter how I address this issue, I just feel like there's a need for synthesis. There's a need for an integral way of thinking, and there's Ken Wilber's work on integral thinking. But you've also got this emergence now of this idea of metamodernism, which is actually finding balance between modernity and postmodernity, because in many ways, postmodernity arrived as a result of the excesses of modernity, and now we're at the other end of like the excesses of postmodernity. And you know, I whether this is a pendulum effect or more like an echo, you know, we've got this kind of like zigzagging to the extremes of one end of the polarity, and we never come to this stillness of just, okay, well, we can have this objectivity and subjectivity, they can live in harmony. We can have the individual and we can have the collective, they can live in harmony. We never seem to reach that point. We always swing straight past it and back to another extreme. So where we are right now, it's interesting, the terminology that's being used. A lot of people who are talking about the corporatism, the trajectory of the Great Reset, the terms that are used are awake. We're awake to these patterns, similarly to the woke terminology. We're actually rallying against the current establishment, as were the kind of counterculture movement in the 60s. There's so many parallels to what resulted in the kind of hippie movement, the counterculture of the 60s to where we are now, but it's almost happening in reverse. It feels like it's a response or reaction to an overextending philosophy that emerged. So my interest around this is this then going to lead to that counterculture? And if so, you know, the 60s, you know, everyone dressed differently. It was radical, like you say. It distinctly stood out from mainstream culture. Can we anticipate something of that nature now? The fact that more people are talking about these issues, the fact that, you know, we started with my trepidation and other people are feeling that trepidation. I know they are, because of the vitriol that comes with it. And, you know, you lost your by your own choice by the sound of things, but you didn't feel comfortable in the institution that you were part of because of where it went. And this is happening right now. People don't want to speak up because they're afraid of the vitriol and what it will come. But I'm starting to see more people raising their voice and saying, well, hang on a minute, I'm not comfortable where this is at. So is there a seed of a counterculture emerging?
Oh yeah. Oh, absolutely. This is very much it's very much a counterculture that's being developed, that's emerging without a question. My concern with it is, as I said, that it is able to represent itself in the way that it'll make a difference, that it could overturn some of these trends, and to do so in a principled fashion that has principles that it's advocating for. For example, you went back, you mentioned that, you know, progress and progressivism assumes that there's nothing to preserve that's worthwhile. So, you know, this is true in the U.S., for example. You have the left basically using the affordances given by the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights in order to destroy the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights. So they're using free speech in order to destroy free speech. They're using the free market to destroy the free market. They're using individual rights of their own to destroy the individual rights of others. This is where it leads. And so it has to be a principled opposition that knows what principles to preserve. And then progress happens technologically. This is almost inevitable, that technological progress will take place, that economic benefits will increase with the increasing wealth of society, that greater comfort and ease could be the result depending on how this is administered, how the technology is administered. But first, we need to get back to primary premises. We need to get back to the principles that would make this kind of progress work without destroying the very thing that we're trying to improve.
I think that's the key here. And I think what's interesting is, you know, our community, we've got people who, and I think there's a growing conversation around how the traditional left and right paradigms are no longer appropriate. And I think that there is some degree of that being true, but at the same time, I think that's largely been born out of the kind of different segments that have emerged within the traditional left and right. You know, it's almost been segmented into these different categories, which makes it difficult to, you know, for people to identify where they belong on the scale. But there's this increasingly on the kind of slightly left of center and the slightly right of center, this increasingly desire to actually, you know, marry the two, progress and preservationism. And that to me is, if we can find that balance, well, you know, and come to accept that point, I think we'll find a lot more harmony in the world. But it's the reality. We've got these. And, you know, we've talked briefly about totalitarianism, and Matthias, when he was here recently, talked about the conditions that lead to mass formation, lead to totalitarianism. And one of those key elements is background anxiety. You've got social discontent. You've got loneliness and isolation. I always forget the fourth, but meaning and purpose. But lack of meaning and purpose. But this idea of loss of social bonds, we see within these kind of emergent communities, people are getting a real sense of belonging. And as the world becomes more fragmented, because that political spectrum has become incredibly fragmented, we've also got this, you know, postmodern understanding of identity, which fragments things even further. So we've now got these micro communities emerging where there is this belonging, and where it's meeting that desire for belonging, but it's bringing us further and further apart as a humanity as a whole. I'm curious how we can break that pattern of human beings almost feel like they have this wired need for belonging, but how do we escape the desire to be politically belong to it? Because the way I look at politics, I don't know if you're a sports fan, but it's almost like the blue team versus the red team. And if you belong on the red team, you're always going to jeer the blue team, even if you prefer the blue team.
It's tribal. It's a tribalism. Yeah. I think we have to unite on the questions of principle, and also it's got to be a battle place of ideas. It's still going to have to be fought in the battle place of ideas. Some people are going to have to basically rethink some things, including myself. Everybody will have to rethink some things to see where, in fact, we have common ground. And then to, you mentioned, preservation. I think that is integral to integral theory. That is the idea that you both subsume and you transcend something at the same time. Mm-hmm. So, Engels, speaking of Marxism, Engels called this sublation, in which there's an element that gets taken over, but it's subsumed without being destroyed simultaneously. That's the kind of process that we need. And I believe that it revolves around really simple principles, and that we can basically come to some common ground on the basis of these principles.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Michael. This has been a really, really important conversation, and thank you for making it an easy step into this difficult world. You've shared a very broad view of the history and some of the guiding philosophies and cultural elements that are all intertwined within this difficult conversation. So thank you very much for your time here today. There's an abundance that I think we're going to have to get you back. There's an abundance that I'd like to ask even further on this, or we could even put together some panels, because the other big piece that I think is missing is this, one of my previous guests called is the God-shaped hole, and how this, how these various behaviors are playing out in a kind of Puritan, almost religious sense. And there's a whole hour-long conversation, I think, on that piece.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, sure. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Indeed. And in terms of for people to follow on with your work, your books, your social channels, what are the best places for people to look for your material?
I keep it all in one place, michaelrectenwald.com. That's Michael Rechtenwald, RECTENWALD, no H, no K, michaelrectenwald.com. Everything's there. Essays, books, interviews, media appearances, also events, speaking engagements, etc.
Thank you, Michael. It's been a real pleasure. This has been a fascinating conversation. And for our listeners at home, let us know your thoughts on the conversation today. We've opened the door now. Let's have courageous conversations about this. Let's be open and respectful to different views on this, and let's learn from each other. So let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you'd like more conversations like this, please do come and join our mailing list at danastingregory.com/podcast. And if you'd really like to delve into topics around this one, we have a private network called the Elevate Network, which you can join at weareelevate.org, where we're examining a whole range of cultural and social and systemic issues that the world is facing. So it'll be a pleasure to host you there too. So thank you again, Michael, and thanks to our audience at home. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode of Michael Rectenwald. As I set out at the beginning of the episode, this was always going to be a sensitive and highly politicized conversation. But I do think it's important that we start to create the courageous public spaces that are necessary in order to tackle some of the difficult cultural and social issues of today. In fact, not exclusively restricted to social and cultural issues, but more broad political and economic issues that are affecting all of our lives. And as I mentioned at the beginning of today's episode, we are planning a tour, the Raise the Nation tour, to get out across the UK to talk about how the political system is broken, and that how by coming together we can find new solutions, we can build alternatives, and we can create solutions to the pressing problems that are facing our livelihoods in the UK. So to find out more, I invite you to come and join us inside the Elevate Network at weareelevate.org. And look out for our next live episode on Monday, where I'll be talking more about the tour that we're planning to deliver over the coming months, alongside the political hustings that are taking place amongst the Conservative Party candidates, party leadership candidates. So watch this space. Again, head over to weareelevate.org, join our community, and keep up to date with everything that we're working on. Thanks again for tuning in. Please do share this episode, and I look forward to seeing you on our next episode of the Elevate podcast. Thanks for tuning in.